طيب نحن مجموعة أجزاء جميعا نشكل عملا فنيا. هذه المرة سنتكلم عن المنسوجات، عن النسيج وكيف لعب دورا في تشكيل الهوية منذ أول تاريخنا إلى عاصرنا ومستقبلنا. تدير هذه الحلقة الأستاذة التي كانت معنا البارحة وأثرت فينا كثيرا، الأستاذة الرائعة والخنينة دائما من الكويت، الأستاذة ليلى الحمد. ومعنا كذلك عبر الفضاء الافتراضي الفنان والنساج بورفيريو جوتيريس، وهو فنان نسيج ومصمم ومتخصص في الصبغ الطبيعي. ومعنا كذلك الفنانة والمصممة الأستاذة أمان الثويني، والإنسانة جدا الباحثة في مسائل النسيج والعمال وأخلاقيات العمل ورائدة الأعمال الأستاذة شهد الشهيل. فليتفضلوا إلى المسرح.
أنا أسمعك، بس هل تسمعني؟ أوكي. شكرا. أهلا، مساء الخير. Good evening, everyone. The panel discussion is called The Thread of Belonging. And each one has a story to tell, a relationship with thread that has built our identity, our profession, our art. Thread is simple. It's one piece of thread. You put two together, you put three together, you put four, you create a weaving. Thread is functional. It covers us, it creates shelter, but it is also symbolic. It links us to the land, it links us to our ecology. It's a form of communication. When we weave, we are also communicating symbols. And it's a language. For the Sedu weavers, for example, it's their form of poetry. So today we have with us three exceptional talents, all the way in Mexico, and طبعاً in Saudi. And we'll be talking about their relationship to thread, their relationship to weaving. Where does that relationship come from? Were you connected to thread through the stories of your grandmother? Were you ever gifted a piece of cloth that connected you to a place? Was it a rite of passage, like in a dowry? Thread allows us to connect. It allows us to build bridges. It is transformational. As I mentioned, thread is not just functional. It allows us to communicate, to weave stories. In some cultures, it's a form of protection. So we'll start our journey today in Mexico with the textile artist Porfirio Gutierrez. Porfirio, thank you for being there. You are an artist with a mission to conserve, preserve, and innovate. You have made 200 colors, natural dyes, in nature. Your work is not just about art, it's a philosophy of life. It's a form of connection to your land and to your roots. Can you tell us a little bit about your art form? What brought you there? What makes it so magical?
Assalamu alaikum. Buenas tardes a todos. Good evening and good morning to me. I'm actually at my studio in Oaxaca, Mexico right now. My work is deeply driven by nature and the understanding of the ancestors. I was born and raised being part of an ancestral tradition of the Zapotec nations here in the Americas. And so much of these deep understanding about nature, about the plant, the symbolic elements, has obviously been something that has been passed down generation after generation. And I was blessed enough to be born and raised by a healer and also farmer and weaver as my parents. So much of this ancestral knowledge has been carried on into my work and to be able to create a conversation with ancestral knowledge and in contemporary art world or in contemporary design.
So I have a question to ask. You work in natural dyes, and you make your own natural dyes from nature. But natural dyes are also trendy. It's a trend. Everybody now is in the let's say a lot of artists, a lot of textile artists are let's say exploring natural dyes. What makes you different, and how does that make you feel that it's a trend?
Definitely, for me, it has nothing to do with the trend. It is the cultural value. It is the deep understanding about how colors has been possible for thousands and thousands of years. And in fact, facing this challenge with trends could terrorize nature, could hurt nature in some way. So for me, it is the understanding of the deep respect that nature is alive, just like us. And my work is driven by that understanding.
Yeah, in fact, I read somewhere something that you said, which I have to say struck really a nice chord with me. And you said that you do not want natural dye to gain prominence in the globalized textile industry because that could lead to terrorizing nature for the ingredients. So, in a way, there's a catch-22 because, on the one hand, let's say it's nice to connect to nature, and what you're doing connects us to nature. But if we overexploit it, we actually terrorize it and we impoverish nature. So in a way, but at the same time, there's this textile industry that is devouring us. It's devouring our waters, it's devouring our space. We have landfills filled with clothes. So we have this culture of consumption that is, creating unnecessary clothes. And then you're creating this beautiful, handmade weavings that are using natural dyes. But at the same time, you're saying these should not be accessible to everybody. So how do you manage this catch-22? I mean, it's, let's say, this overall issue of this paradox.
Yeah, I think that the biggest problem with consumption is consuming something that it's disposable. I think the type of work that I do, and even for my ancestors, these clothing used to be made for us and for trade. And since it's such a good quality, these are material that comes from nature. It takes literally years and years to be able to need another. So it is definitely now in the market because and these maybe you focus on valuing handmade things. That's an investment for our clothing that we might not need to buy one every season, but instead it is something that we could cherish because it's quality.
Mm-hmm. In a way, kind of going back to our childhood when we had one special dress for Eid, which is considered our holy holidays, or in your case, Christmas, perhaps. And instead of having a dress for every week or every occasion, no? So in a way to make things more special, see them more as investments. In fact, this is a point that I'm going to raise with Shahad because I know this is something that's dear to her heart. It would be great if we could see, I don't know if you can see some of Porfirio's work in the screen. I don't know if that's on display. It would be great. The slides, yeah. So they show, I think maybe Porfirio, can you talk a little bit about the slides that you sent us? Did you hear me, Porfirio?
Yeah, I'm sorry. My connections is quite poor right now.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just saying if you could perhaps just touch upon the slides that you sent and talk about what the images, the 3 images that you sent us.
Yeah, so the first image is just giving a little bit of perspective of where I come and about my culture. Again, I come from this ancestral understanding and also a syncretism when through the colonial period 500 years ago when the Spanish arrived here. So our life started to take a new shape at that point. But so much of our way of life, our ceremonies, our textiles, it's still preserved the ancestral beliefs and ways of being. And that it is obviously such a rich culture and understanding that translates. If we go to the next message, to the next image, you can start to see how some of these tradition is being translated in such a contemporary language that it also makes it relevant to today's society.
It would be great if we
And
could
of course, and if we go to the next slide.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so these designs that you see on these weavings are obviously in forms where I come from through the symbolic elements that is still find in the archaeological ceremonial sites here in our area. So much of that it's a forefront and communicates to where I come from, but also where my life is and where I'm at in the modern society. I have been living in the United States for the last 24 years of my life. So much of these biocultural interaction with two different countries, a much more ancestral way of being and understanding the world in a much more modern and urban America.
Touching on this last point, so you are from Oaxaca but you moved to the US when you were much younger. And is that where your art form began? So were you in the US when you started your art form? Was being in the US the enabler to be able to kind of reconnect to your heritage, or were you already involved in that work?
Yeah, it traditionally has been within my family. We started to being involved in different aspects of creating each piece since a very young age. So by the time I was aware of being around 10 years old, I was already helping in different aspects, winding bobbins, collecting some of the medicine plant. And by the time I was 12 years old, that's when I formally learned how to weave by my father. And when I was 18, that's when I migrated to United States. And by being away, enabling me to recognize and revalue these art form. And in fact, my existence as an artist, it is that I discover the gift that that was inherited to me by my ancestors. So that's why I resumed my art form again. It was at that point by a choice. It wasn't anymore something that I had to do.
It was an impulse. And I like when you say that you're not defined by a border. I mean, you literally live between two lands that are connected by a border, but two completely different culture. One that has a culture of weaving that goes back thousands of years, and then another one that is perhaps rich in other forms of culture, no? And how has being in the US helped this conversation for you? How has it, let's say, valorized your art form? Do you feel that if you'd stayed in Mexico, your art form would not be as valorized? Being in California has given you an opportunity in some way?
Most definitely. And I think living in the United States has enriched my art tremendously. I don't think my art and my understanding through my art will be as is if I would have not left the community. In so many ways, if we go to the next image, please, then in so many ways, I came to be independent from my own culture, because sometimes culture tends to also keep you in an environment where it's hard for you to be able to expand your vision and understanding maybe of the world. But also when I mentioned that my work is not defined by the borders, because our ancestors has been living in this part of the Americas for thousands of years, and the indigenous people of this land has been interacting trading amongst them for thousands and thousands of years. So the border came to be later. Mexico became to be Mexico 500 years ago, as well as United States. But as indigenous people of the Americas, we have been living in this land, and in this case, my work is driven by the nature and the land, and it celebrates also the people that now calls this land of the Americas home.
Absolutely. What you do is really beautiful, and it ties very nicely to Amani's work. Amani, I'm going to introduce you. You have a BA in architecture, which I found really interesting. And now you are an artist and a designer. And I like that architecture has influenced your approach to art. So maybe you can tell us how an architect becomes involved in the world of textiles and what weaving means to you, and perhaps introduce us to some of the work that you've been doing, including your relationship to heritage, culture, el-dezza, all of the impressive work that you've been doing the last few years.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. So I think my architecture background really informs the way I work. So my process in terms of planning, defining the geometry of my work. So after doing my BA in architecture, I did my MFA in fine arts, and my interest in weaving and textiles, that's when it started. I've always been interested in topics of tradition in relation to luxury and consumer culture, and how tradition is kind of how tradition transforms based on class, based on trade, based on all of these things. And maybe if we can turn on the slides, please. I can show you some of my work.
It would be great if they could put your slides. Is that?
How does it? Oh, it's showing. Sorry, I can't see it here.
I can't see it. Okay.
How do I go back?
Perfect.
Sorry, again. Can we do that again? Oh. Yes, thank you. So in my work, I use symbols from different textiles, such as sadu or Turkish kilams, and I'm amplify them and create these theatrical installations that kind of talk about the history versus the contemporary. And I talk specifically in these works about the tradition of the dowry, which is dezza, in the Gulf region. So all these symbols that you see on top are actually taken from Turkish kilim, and they represent women and dowry. So they're usually evident in pieces that are either given to the bride or made by the bride. And I kind of reinterpreted them to document specific moments in history of Kuwait, talking about the different stages that the dowry takes. So for example, the dowry was a simple pouch with money, and after the trade with India, it became a bundle of fabrics given to the bride, which she can use to make her own dresses. And then after that became a chest, a wooden chest, and after trade with Europe and globalization, then it became all about the consumer brands and products. So I was documenting different stages, and and also kind of thinking about how we as artists and designers shift this tradition. We need to remember that this tradition is ours, and we are there to use it and take advantage of it and transform it and change it and play with it. So it's very important to think about the different ways it can transform. And this is some of my other works. So for example, I worked a lot with Sadu House on installations, and what I'm curious and interested in is how the different symbolism changes. And for example, the Sadu symbols shown in relation to weddings is the amulet, for example. So I was thinking about how can we represent our current state or current life through the change of these symbols. So I was playing with these different floats. It's about the survival of Sadu. So the floats represents the survival, and how we can pinpoint different changes in time, and for example, showing symbols from social media and location, Google Maps, or like liking something on Instagram, or consumer behavior, shopping, and etc. This is another piece in relation to Dezza. It's also a representation of how the bride moves from her family's house to the in-laws' house, but it also talks about one specific Dezza type in Kuwait in a specific year, which was pieces of luggage with gifts inside them. So for me, after doing my MFA and this show, I was interested to transform the Dezza into, like you said, Layla, in our previous conversation, bringing the thread back, which means bringing the preciousness of the Dezza back, because it became more about the product, the consumer goods, rather than the vessel that holds the gifts together. So how do you bring this mystery or the unknown back into it? And this is where Dezza Lab, my business, launched. And what I'm trying to do is to bring back the thread, embroidery, the handmadeness, the craft, and also make it into a furniture piece that is used after the event, so that the dowry piece is more about, keeping this precious item from generation to another.
Can I ask you a question? So when you researched the Dezza in the olden days, what would you say made up the Dezza? Was it mainly fabric? Was it furniture? So what went into the Dezza in the olden days as opposed to the modern Dezza?
So there was a lot of changes. The main element that didn't change is the actual, currency, money. So it was money in a pouch or money in an envelope, and then it became a bundle of fabrics, and then it took the form of a wooden chest when Kuwait had trade with India, and then synthetic leathers when we had more material options, and then it became, for example, acrylic displays that are discarded after the event. So it became less and less about the fabric. So it kind of disappeared.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I read on your website that your work on identity and culture was in a way inspired by you being outside and looking in. Well, also because you're half Ukrainian and you lived outside. So in a way, how did that open your eyes? I mean, is your reading of culture, let's say, influenced by being outside or being half Kuwaiti, half Ukrainian? And do you feel that, you mentioned keeping the tradition and the ritual alive. if it continues to be an extremely materialistic ritual as opposed to meaningful, because I do believe that rituals need to have meaning, not just, let's say, it's not just a commodity, it's not a process. Should it stay alive? I mean, and what do we do about that? I mean, this is more of an existential issue about, let's say, consumerism in the Gulf in general.
First question was about me being half Kuwaiti, half Ukrainian. Yes, because I always felt like I was curious about Kuwaiti tradition. I didn't feel like I was part of it 100%. So one event that really opened my eyes was getting married and receiving the dowry myself. I kind of started questioning how things go, the process, the material form it takes, and all of that. And this is where the research really happened. But I was always curious about, cultural symbols, even being exposed to that during my childhood with Russian folk and fairy tales and all of that. So it was a big part of my life. And the second question was, yes, I think as humans, we always have strong relationship with objects, but it depends on the use, what this object means to you. If it's that's kind of my goal, is to question all these things. I don't have an answer for it, but I think the physicality of it is important, and but it's just about asking ourselves how and what forms it can take to make it more for the soul.
Yeah, beautiful. I fully agree. This takes me now to Shahad. So Shahad, your work is beautiful. I mean, the Abadiya's work is really beautiful. And I like that you say that each piece is a timeless edition, because I love the word timeless, because it means that it's something that's durable. It's not trendy, it doesn't go out of fashion. It's something that you can keep special, you can hand it to your daughter, and I love that. So can you tell us a little bit about what took you on this journey and how you feel about these values? I also like the fact that you put your values on the website, and I think that's such an important thing. We all have values, and somehow it's important to put them out there.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Masakum Allah bil khair. From the start of Abadia, actually, my journey into the world of fashion and textile came because I felt we had a huge disconnection from where our clothes come from. And with that, we were participating in an industry that was harming the environment and harming the people that make our clothes. So when we decided to make the brand, we wanted from the beginning to create a product that connected the consumer to the story behind their clothing, that was made in a very ethical and sustainable way, and that stood on very strong values. And I hope, to your point, our goal is to create pieces that are timeless. My hope is that to see one day people passing them on to the next generation, and it makes me so happy to hear when people say that they keep it in their closet and save it for, something that is so special. From the beginning, we wanted to work specifically to preserve the craftsmanship of our region, because I really do believe that in that craftsmanship, we hold a lot of beautiful cultural storytelling. And if we don't preserve the craftsmanship, we lose those stories, and we already actually are starting to lose them. If we look at craftsmanship, even across Saudi Arabia, some of the techniques are being lost, and with them, that stories of why did we make them this way? Why did we use this motive? Why did we use this colorway? So that was at the forefront of our mission. And I really do believe that in order for us to preserve the craftsmanship and the storytelling, we need to give artisans that practice that craft an economic incentive to continue to do the work that they do. Because at the end of the day, they were doing that work because it had purpose and it was being used. And so we need to continue to give them economic incentive in order for them to continue to practice that craft. We can't ask them to preserve it without that. So we wanted to create a way to incorporate the craft in our clothing in a very timeless way, and as a result give this artisans an economic and sustainable access to income.
How do you give artisans voice without making them uncomfortable? Because I remember in our discussion you said that when you approach the artisans and you ask them if they want to have a bit more prominence, let's say, they shy away or they're not used to it or it's culturally inappropriate. So how do you square the circle of validating their work and their being and their identity as artisans to be something to be proud of, and at the same time, not making them uncomfortable, not rejecting that side, or not playing it down too much?
Yeah, I mean it's culturally sensitive, and at the end of the day, we have to be conscious of those cultural sensitivities. We definitely want to tell the stories of the artisans, and nothing makes me happier than documenting these stories visually as well as audibly. But we have to do that with the consent and comfort of the artisan. So it depends. There is a lot of artisans in the beginning that didn't want to use their names. They just wanted to use the mother of kind of title, and we obviously respect that. We try as much as possible to document their stories in a way that they're comfortable with it. So we did a series called Artisan Voices, where we just recorded their voices responding to questions that we had. And it's different from artisan to artisan. But I think one of the biggest lessons for me from the work that we've done is that if we give artisans, the income that's required for them to keep doing the craft, plus give them the recognition that this craft is something to be proud of and that your technique and your heritage is something that is valuable, with those two elements happening at the same time, you'll actually see them teach it to the next generation. And you'll see the next generation actually interested in learning it because it's respected and it generates income. So we try and we see that happening through kind of our interactions with them, but documenting their stories is always a tricky thing.
Just to your point, so on the sustainability of the craftsman, the durability, let's say most of the time craftsmen are of an older generation because they learned their craft from someone older. And you mentioned that you work with artisans in the UAE, in Saudi, in Egypt, and in Lebanon. Do you feel there's a role for education, a bit like, to train? I mean, right now what happens is it's very much at the whim or at the mercy of charities, right?
Yeah.
So oftentimes you see that charities are the ones that support, and that's never sustainable because it's not actually done for a purpose beyond charity. And then but you're quite niche, isn't it? Yours is a small market, and again, the beauty of it is that it's small. But the sustainability requires that there's a bigger investment, not in terms of money, but in terms of thinking and commitment from, let's say, whether it's the private sector, whether it's the Ministry of Culture, although I prefer, maybe not the Ministry of Culture because that doesn't usually work. So, how do you feel about that kind of, this difficulty in preserving and sustaining?
I agree with you. I think we are small, and the demand or the ability to do actually more work, there are a lot more artisans and access to their work is necessary, but it's a supply and demand thing. Yes, we need to teach the craft, but we also need to create opportunities for the craft to reach market, because otherwise we're teaching it without an end, right? And that's what happened, I think, with a lot of charities. In fact, in Saudi, is there's amazing efforts in preserving the craft and training artisans and supporting them financially and all of that. But then when you don't connect them to market and you don't connect market to them, then there's a dead end. But right now, I know that there's a lot more, and I feel it, a lot more attention towards an interest in culture overall, and in Saudi culture specifically, obviously, as we're a nation that's kind of discovering and rediscovering its identity. And at the same time, there are efforts of training. For example, in Al-Ula, there is a school that was set up to train artisans there. But I think the connection to market needs to happen simultaneously. And designers, artists, business professionals, all of that needs to find opportunities to respectfully connect with the artisan. Because going back to Porfirio's comment in the beginning, we don't want it to end where it's being exploited or used in a manner that's out of respect to the work and the story and the effort that has gone into it.
Yeah, I like that. I agree. It has to be a respectful relationship with nature, a respectful relationship to the artisans, and a respectful relationship to our traditions. And I think that this is what ties you all together. You look for the sense of identity, sense of belonging, sense of connection. You're looking for the meaning, and this meaning gives you your identity, and it gives you your sense of well-being. And I think, I mean, what you do, all of you, is inspiration. And again, there's that thread that ties it all together so beautifully through the different values that each one brings into his work, his or her work. Now, I don't know how we are on time. I'm sorry, if somebody could help. And also on questions, if maybe we can open it up now.
بيكون
شكرا.
ليلى. بس قبل ما ندخل على الأسئلة، إذا ممكن بس ناخذ استفتاء من الجمهور على الحديث اللي ذكرته. عندنا استفتاءين. الأول: هل من المحتمل أن تصبح الأنماط الرمزية العصرية اليوم جزءا من تراث الأجيال القادمة؟ نعم، لا، ربما. لكم 30 ثانية عن طريق الQR كود. مئة بالمئة لا. نعم. طيب اللي بعده. إلى أي مدى تعتقد أن الرموز لا تزال تعمل كأدوات لنقل ثقافة الفرد وهويته؟ هذه المرة الاستفتاءات كلها متجهة في اتجاه واحد، واضح أنه في تأثير جيد للمحاضرة. طيب 64%. أستاذة ليلى، تفضلي للأسئلة. الآن أنا باخذ الأسئلة معك.
أيوة شكرا. بس كنت حابة بس ملاحظة، إحنا نسينا نحط صور مالوت الفيجوالز مالوت شاهد للأسف. فإذا ما أدري إذا ممكن الحين تحطونهم بس عشان الجمهور يشوفهم.
They're meant to be in the background, but it actually relates to one of the first question about symbolism and can they be part of today's clothing. And in fact, they are. A lot of sedu. So this is one of our pieces, and it has sedu in it. And the sedu that's created is a symbol that's called ضروس الخيل, which is traditionally created to reflect the nature and specifically horses. And so it can be part of the modern world, but I also love what Aman is doing, where She's actually taking the technique and keeping the technique, but then evolving the symbolism. And I think both of them together can create interesting dynamics. I don't know how to. This is one of our artisans. It's a video, so I don't know if he'll play. Actually creating that ضروس الخيل technique. It takes them about almost 3 days to make 1 meter of this particular pattern, because it's one that's a bit tricky. Beautiful. We don't have to go through them all, just they were back visual aids. This is one of our dresses from our new collection. The bust is all made with Sedu. Again, it's quite modern, and we've worked with the artisans to play around with the weave a bit, so it's a bit more plain. But yeah, I think that definitely symbolism and having aspects of our traditional culture be part of clothing of today is and the future is there already.
حول الأسئلة. تحول الأسئلة. إذا في أحد عنده سؤال تفضلي.
Assalamu alaikum. I think my question, and first I want to kind of know if my question is valid, but I'm always thinking recently, at least I see a lot of women in the Gulf been really developing art practices based on weaving and textiles. But maybe that's my focus because I'm a woman and I'm looking at women. But also, I'm kind of supported by the fact that Sedu is mainly created by women. And I know that they refuse to teach men even that craft. But also, on the other hand, in Mexico, for example, I know I've heard that, we've heard now that it's something kind of more coming from farming and slow life pace. And so I'm really wondering if that's kind of a relationship, because even a man in Mexico is still like very much working on textile throughout history. And so I'm wondering if it's about gender or if it's about life pace and kind of the daily practices that that person goes through.
أستاذة ليلى توجهين سؤال لمن؟
حابة أوجه السؤال لبورفيريو وشهد. Porfirio, would you mind just touching on that issue? We discussed it when we had our conversation about how gendered is the weaving profession, and you were mentioning that originally it was female, but eventually in Mexico it became a male, and things changed with the development of more cumbersome looms. Could you touch on this issue?
Yes, in the ancestor time, women was the ones that was doing the weaving in the process, and men were focusing much more in agriculture and other commitments, of course. And 500 years ago, through the colonization time, the Spanish brought the threadle loom. Previously, my ancestor was using a backstrap loom. So much of like the image the other artist was showing right now. And once the threadle loom was introduced, it needed to, it requires much more physical work. And that's how men started to be trained to weaving. And the last few decades, now women, it started to be involved much more because chemical dyes and machine spun yarn start to be available. So they start to weave. So there was a period of time, especially for my parents who are in their early 80s now, they were working collaborative. So my mother would do the spinning and much of the dyeing, and my father will weave.
Thank you. Shahad, do you want to touch on this?
It's a very interesting question. I think definitely gender plays a role. When you look at Sedu, for example, you just mentioned it's mostly women. But when you even look at the global fashion industry, the majority of people working in every aspect of that supply chain is women. And I don't know if it has to do with opportunity cost, as in like who's bringing income from different aspects. And given that the fashion industry is not very fair to its employees in a very general sense, that it's easier to have female workers than male workers, but that could be a play. But then on another end, you see, for example, fabric weaving in the region even being done by males, like in Bahrain, for example. So I don't have a clear answer for you, but I do think, in my humble opinion, it plays a role.
I just had a conversation recently with Beit Sadu, and they're doing amazing in terms of training people. And I think there are men in different age groups, but mainly I think the reason is because women teach their daughters, so it's kind of like inherited, you know. So mostly it's female in Sadu House, but I think there's an initiative to, you know, start, and there is an interest, there's a bigger interest now in the actual craft in Kuwait. So a lot of people are signing up for it.
Can I just add something? So there's an interesting book, if you're interested in this topic, called Women's Work, The First 20,000 Years. And it goes back to, we're talking, you know, practically prehistoric. Women's work was oftentimes, because they had to have children, they oftentimes had to stay close to the kids. And so they were involved in what the academics call perishable work, perishable being both weaving and feeding. So those were the two crafts. Eventually, with time, as looms developed, like Porfirio mentioned, it could also become a guild. So you had guilds, and usually if the woman had to leave, women wouldn't leave the house. Women's work was at home, and usually they would weave for the family. And if they had extra, they would sell it on the market, they would sell it to their neighbor. While men, in certain cases, when you say you had royalty that demanded certain weaves, certain brocades, etc., they would create guilds with more complex looms. So this is kind of how the world of weaving divided. In the case of the Gulf, the bisht is male weaving, and each part of the bisht is done by one different artisan. So not one artisan does a whole bisht, each one does one part of it. While Sedu weaving is exclusively female, although there is a gentleman in Kuwait, isma Dr. Ali Najada, he's a fantastic academic, and he has learned all about Sedu weaving, and he has even modernized the loom. So anyway, so it goes, this is a topic it's about anthropology, it's about economics, about history. It's a very, very rich, it's actually a rich academic field. If you're interested, I'm happy to share some sources.
في سؤال أخير نختم. طيب أستاذة ليلى، أعتقد أنه نحتاج، إحنا أصلا تعدينا الوقت يعني، لكن نحتاج أن احنا نختم. إذا في كلمة أخيرة من عندك أو من عند أحد الضيوف.
أنا ما عندي كلمة، بس أعتذر أنت أخير.
لا
اعذرني.
طيب إذا في كلمة أخيرة من عندكم؟
Thank you for having us.
طيب شكرا لكم. يعني هذه المحاضرة مختلفة، رائعة، ملهمة في حديثها. ممتن لكم جميعا، وشكرا لكم جميعا.